Okay, hello and welcome everyone. So in this video, I'm going to talk about some of the top mistakes or misunderstandings that come up in a Principles of Microeconomics course. So my comment here is like, over the course of my experience teaching, these are some of the common mistakes that I see students making. In my classes, I try to kind of teach against these things, and so that just from the get-go, try to avoid some of these misunderstandings. But nevertheless, one of the things that we realize about studying economics in general, and then especially the principles level, is that we approach the course with a lot of economic intuition from life to this point. And lots of that intuition is helpful. Lots of it goes in the right direction of what we want to be able to ultimately apply. But sometimes our own inertia, own momentum can be kind of get in the way of proper understanding. And I think maybe that's part of what's responsible for some of these issues. Nevertheless, like these are kind of 10 things that come up, and actually 10 plus, like more than 10 things. And so I want to take the time to address them here. All right, so the first thing is thinking about, and these are kind of in order of the way that you'd encounter them through the course, right? So I mean for this to be, in some sense, useful for kind of comprehensive final exam review, as well as just thinking about from the outset, like what are the useful things to watch out for. Like in Mankiw's text, it starts with like 10 principles of economics, and that's kind of like a lot of principles courses will use Mankiw, and we'll think about like these 10 principles of economics being really useful for thinking about organizing our view of what we're ultimately going to study. In the Stevenson and Wolfers text, we introduce the four core principles of economics, around which we introduce the entire structure of what we cover in econ. I mean, that's useful, and it's a good way to kind of think about structuring our content. I think it's also important to think about like what are the pitfalls? What are the places where things go awry? And so that's what this is. All right, so opportunity cost. So keep in mind the opportunity cost of an activity. It's the value of the next highest alternative foregone, right? Opportunity costs represent sacrifice. You could be doing one thing with these resources, or you could do something else. And the opportunity cost is what's foregone. It's what you're losing, right? And so my comment here, it's not what you get to do, it's what you get to lose. It's what you give up when you do one thing instead of another, right? So I think the misunderstanding comes from the term opportunity, because you see like, oh, opportunity, so it sounds like something you get to do. No, it's what you get to lose, right? So here's my example. Suppose you get a free ticket to a concert or performance. Maybe the ticket usually costs $30. The opportunity cost of attending the concert is not $30, right? So the opportunity cost of attending the concert is going to include like the foregone value, the other uses of the time and resources that you'd expend if you were doing something other than the concert, right? And so what we want to think about is, well, the value of your time if you were studying or doing something other than going to this concert, right? It's not the $30, right? The $30, yeah, it's something that you don't have to pay for to be able to go to the concert. It certainly makes the cost of attending the concert lower, but it's not an opportunity cost, right? So opportunity cost is the value of the time foregone. It's not the value of the ticket, right? So it can be a little bit, some examples, it can be a little bit easier to quantify if, for instance, like rather than just this abstract value of your time that you'd be spending otherwise, maybe you have a job that pays, $15 per hour, then the opportunity cost of going to the concert would be $15 times the number of hours you would have worked, right? So this way we could kind of quantify exactly what would be the value of the time that you've lost. But more generally, right, it's just like the alternative uses of the resources that you're not able to apply to those other things, right? So the value of my time when I go to the concert, the value of any additional money that I end up spending because I've gone to the concert, maybe for Uber or for snacks or concessions or whatever, things that I wouldn't have been incurring if I wasn't going, as part of the full cost of attending the concert, right? Opportunity cost is what you get to lose, what you give up, not what you get. All right, supply and demand. So, term economists use for the amount of a good consumers are willing to buy at a certain price is quantity demanded, right? That's the amount. By demand, we mean actually the entire relationship between prices and quantity demanded at a particular price, right? So, it's an entire collection of all the pairs of price and quantity demanded. That's what we mean by demand. And then for supply, for the supply side, for seller side, the amount sellers are willing to bring to the market at a given price is what we mean by quantity supplied. The entire relationship of all such pairs of price and quantity supplied, or amounts that people or the sellers are willing to bring to the market, is what we mean by supply. Right. So I think where the misunderstanding enters, though, has to do with the way that we think about supply and demand in common language. So for instance, to an economist, it's wrong to say when prices rise, demand falls. Though we hear this all the time, right? From smart people in the media and in news reports and so on and so forth, like other current event articles, you'll see actually exactly this language. It's wrong from the perspective of economics, right? So an economist would say instead, when prices rise, then quantity demanded falls, right? The law of demand is at higher prices, there's a lower quantity demanded. So the distinction actually has to do like graphically between thinking about a movement along a demand curve versus a shift, right? So if prices change, then only quantity can change. And the change is going to move us up or down a single demand curve that's otherwise stationary. If something other than price changes, that's when the entire demand curve can shift, right? And so we want to think about all of our determinants of demand, and same for supply, all of our determinants of supply. We have a whole collection of factors. So for demand, the things that can actually change demand or can lead to an increase or decrease in demand are things like number of buyers, change in consumer income, change in consumer tastes and preferences, changes in the prices of related goods, be it substitutes or complements, and changes in expected future prices. And actually, I should be a little bit more specific when we're talking about changes in income, because it actually matters. Are we talking about a normal or an inferior good in terms of which direction the change in income is going to cause, right? If we have a normal good, then as income rises, demand's going to increase as you might expect. But if we have an inferior good, as income rises, demand decreases, right? So as we're thinking about like one of these factors shifting the demand curve, we're assuming the supply curve hasn't moved. In order to get a change in supply, now we need to have like something, one of our determinants of supply changing. So for instance, things like change in the number of firms, change in production technology, change in the price of important inputs, changes in the prices of complements or substitutes in production. So thinking about like the alternatives that firms could be making with their products, right? So like Apple could make an iPhone, an iPad, or an iPod. Those are all substitutes in production, using largely the same components, right? Or complements in production. So think about, maybe there's some useful byproduct, like, maybe you've got like a baked bean company, and as you shell the beans, you get these, the waste product is like the shell. Maybe you can grind it down and make kitty litter from it, right? So the product that you're interested in making is like beans and then baked beans, and then maybe you can grind down whatever was the shell that you sheared off of the bean, and then you can make kitty litter. That would be a complement in production. You've got a useful byproduct. And then the last one was the change in expected future prices, right? So think about like anything that's going to change demand or change supply. You want to identify one of our demand or supply shifters, and then think about in which direction that's going to have the effect, right? And in doing so, we're going to assume that the other side hasn't changed at all, right? So, all right, let's think about this in terms of like an example. Suppose there's a positive news report comes out about some product. That's going to change consumer tastes and preferences. As a result, we're going to get a shift to the demand curve. It's a positive news report, so it's going to be an increase in demand, right? So it's good news. There's an increase in demand. We model that as it's a rightward shift. I can read, right? Rightward shift. What happens to supply? Absolutely nothing happens to supply. This is what I mean by just assuming that the other curve is entirely stationary. We've got this positive news report, get an increase in demand, model that as a rightward shift, and then against a stationary supply curve, right? So we assume absolutely nothing else about like what's happening for the supply side, right? So as the demand curve shifts against it, we're going to get a higher equilibrium price and quantity. Where's another common error? Well, there's another common error to try to tell some story about what's happening to supply, right? So maybe people would say something like, due to the positive effect on taste and preferences, the increase in demand leads to some increase in supply to meet demand, right? Which is completely kind of wrong way to think about it. The reason why is to be able to get supply to change, we need something other than price to change that's going to act on the supply side. We have to identify one of our determinants of supply, which we haven't done. Rather, what's actually happening is this positive news report gave us an increase in demand, which causes so model with a rightward shift, which causes a movement up the supply curve. We've got a higher price, which is going to cause a higher quantity supplied. Now, my comment here is that, truthfully, it's better not to even mention this, right? Instead, what we want to do is just think of one cause, one effect, right? So we've got this positive news report that's going to positively change consumer tastes and preferences. We'll rightward shift demand, get a higher price, higher quantity, in the new equilibrium. End of story. That's the place to stop, right? When we have a change in demand or supply, just simply seek out the impact on the market price and quantity. Never try to seek out an impact on the other curve. To do something with the other curve, be it demand or supply, we need something else that's changing. So the appropriate way to think about this graphically is we had our positive news report. This changed tastes and preferences for consumers, right? This gave us a rightward shift to the demand curve. I like writing my original demand with bold, my original supply with bold, and then if I shift, right, if I have a change in demand, I like using a dashed line. That way, if I haven't got colors, it's a lot easier, just like with pencil or pen, to be able to identify, even without the labels, where my beginning and ending point was. And actually, when I'm drawing these out, if I typically I'd put like a solid dot here for the original equilibrium and then an open circle for the new equilibrium. And it helps me keep clear like where was our starting point, where was our finishing point. But anyway, as a result of this rightward shift of demand, what's happening to supply? Well, nothing, right? As a result of this rightward shift of demand, we've got an increase in price. At that higher price changes. What happens on the supply curve? We get a change in quantity supplied. We've moved up the supply curve, right? That's what's happened. All right, so next thing is to think about elasticity. So there's a lot of misunderstandings that creep up around elasticity, right? Namely, we cannot judge price elasticity of demand on the basis of the sign of elasticity, nor on the fact that the quantity demanded may or may not have changed, right? It's an error to try to observe that the price elasticity of demand is negative or positive in absolute value, and then try to make some type of inference about whether the good is elastic or inelastic, right? The reason why is, well, the sign's always negative, and the reason why that happens is because demand curves are downward sloping. The law of demand holds. Other things equal, at higher prices, there's a lower quantity demanded. Similarly, if we observe that price changes and quantity demanded changes, we can't simply declare that demand must be elastic. Price elasticity of demand gives us the responsiveness or the sensitivity to changes in price, right? So you can't discern price elasticity of demand on the basis of the sign, nor can you on the fact that quantity demanded even changed, right? It's not the fact that it's changed as a result of a price change, it's what's the proportional size of the change in quantity demanded relative to the proportional size of the change in price. After all, the definition of price elasticity of demand is percentage change in quantity demanded divided by the percentage change in price, right? If we're talking about the price elasticity of demand, we're talking about a movement along a single demand curve. We already know by the law of demand, prices rise, quantity demanded falls, and what we're interested in is by how much. Did it change a lot or a little? Because what elasticity is giving us above and beyond the law of demand is how much the change in quantity demanded was relative to the change in price. Measured in percentages, right? If quantity changes by a greater percentage than price changes, then the numerator is bigger than the denominator, right? We say demand is pretty responsive and therefore elastic, and this ratio is going to be greater than 1 in absolute value. If quantity changes by a smaller percentage than the price changes, we'd say demand is pretty unresponsive and therefore inelastic, right? So there, if price changes by a lot more, we have a much larger denominator, and then our price elasticity of demand ratio would be something less than 1 in absolute value, something between 0 and 1, right? Think about like increasingly small fractions, like 1/2, 1/3, 1/4, all with the property of having a larger denominator. This correspond to inelastic demands, 1/2 or 0.5, 0.33, 0.25, right? All right, so the last thing is just thinking about, let me clarify what I was talking about with the sign here. As the price rises, what's going to happen is a percentage change in price might be positive, right? When price rises, the percentage change in quantity demanded, that's going to be negative, right? We get an increase in price, we get a decrease in quantity demanded by the law of demand. Or if price decreases, so we have a negative sign here, we've got to have a positive sign here, right? And think about like where the sign's coming from. That's actually important if you're thinking in terms of the midpoint formula. I didn't put that on here, but if you're thinking about the midpoint formula, and you recognize it on the basis of me just mentioning it, you're thinking about like a whole bunch of Q1s and Q2s and P1s and P2s and 2s and whatever and lots of divide bars. Now, the way to think of the midpoint formula for price elasticity of demand is to think in terms of the change in quantity divided by the average quantity, that whole thing divided by the change in price divided by the average price, right? So the numerator is change in quantity, Q2 minus Q1 divided by the average quantity. Denominator is P2 minus P1 divided by the average price. And it's better to think about it that way than to try to think about Q1s and Q2s and P1s and P2s and divide by 2s and everything else, because if that's confusing, if that sounds confusing to me, it's probably confusing to you as well. Just think in terms of dividing the change by the average. All right, so taxes, right? Per unit tax does not generally raise the equilibrium price by an amount equal to the tax. Per unit tax does not generally raise the equilibrium price by an amount equal to the tax. Right? There's a specific exception if demand or supply is perfectly inelastic, but the reason why not is because if there's slope to our demand and supply curve, right? If they're downward and up, if demand is downward sloping, supply is upward sloping, then when the tax is assessed, it's going to alter the price, and there's also a quantity response, right? So what happens is when the per unit tax is applied to the good, consumer is going to purchase a smaller amount. Smaller amount is going to correspond to a higher point in the demand curve, lower point in the supply curve, and the quantity purchased after the tax is applied corresponds to where demand is above the supply curve by an amount equal to the tax, right? That's the thing to kind of keep in mind is when you're shifting the supply curve or the demand curve, you're going to do that always and everywhere by an amount equal to the tax. And if you think about that and think about it graphically, that's kind of exactly why the price buyers pay isn't going to rise by the amount of the tax. So the interpretation that the vertical height of the supply curve corresponds to the marginal cost of producing that unit, that's our interpretation. If the good is sold at cost, right, that would be the proceeds necessary to go to the seller. If we sold the good for exactly what was the marginal cost, right, that would exactly cover the seller's cost of producing. Government gets their share too. That brings us up to the demand curve. So let me talk about this in terms of the graph. Now what's going on here with the graph? So I've got my price here on the vertical axis. I've got my quantity on the horizontal axis. Here's our initial equilibrium. So kind of following the convention I said before, like my starting point always to be bold. And then after a shift, I have a dashed line. And you're staring at this, you're like, I've got kind of a lot of things going on here, right? Well, what's happened is, turns out, for a per unit tax, remember, tax incidence doesn't have to do with who the tax is assessed from, right? If you have a tax on buyers or if you have a tax on sellers, it's this picture. Actually, it doesn't matter if it's a tax on buyers or a tax on sellers. You're going to get the same quantity after the tax is assessed, and you will get the same price buyers pay and the same price sellers receive, right? And at the quantity that results after the tax is assessed, the supply curve and demand curve, the supply curve will be exactly the length, the vertical distance between the supply and demand curve at that quantity will be exactly the size of the tax, right? All right, let me talk about this a little bit more carefully, kind of explain what I've got. So here would be our original equilibrium if there wasn't a tax. Just ignore these dashed lines for the time being, right? Our original equilibrium would be right here. Here would be the quantity, there would be the price. Now we've got a per unit tax, which is going to raise the price of each unit sold by an amount, or is going to affect the price of each unit sold by an amount equal to the tax. So one way that we could do this is we could make this a tax on sellers. If we think about this as a tax on sellers, remember the vertical height of the supply curve is capturing cost to sellers, right? The theory of supply is the theory of marginal cost. So the vertical height of a supply curve is the marginal cost of producing that unit. And now we can think of like, here's the cost necessary to generate like whatever is this quantity, but now for each unit, the government's assessing an additional amount, right? And you can almost think of the tax as this like artificial input, right? Think of like all the ingredients necessary for my cookie factory, flour, sugar, eggs, and now the government's saying I also have to put tax into the cookies I'm making. They're going to taste terrible. But nevertheless, we've got this like artificial input that we're adding in that additional ingredient brings us up to here at every point, right? right, so we got this leftward shift of the supply curve is how we'd model the tax inclusive supply curve. We'd find the equilibrium quantity by where the tax inclusive supply crosses the original demand, goes straight down. We'd find our quantity that's going to result with a tax. The price that buyers pay come from this price right here. The price sellers receive, well, think about what's going to happen. Buyers are taking money out of their wallet, giving it to the sellers, and the sellers have to, well, pay for all their input costs, right? Pay for all their costs, and one of those things they're paying for is tax. And so they'll deduct the amount that's going to go to the government off, and that's going to be this distance right here. And then whatever remains is going to cover their production costs, right? Okay, so the other way that we could think about this is as a tax on buyers. So if we have a tax on buyers, then what happens is, well, when the buyer sees the price tag, right, they're gonna have to pay, for the good, but then also for the tax, right? So think about like, excuse me. Think about like how depressing it was as a child. Like you save up, $5, whatever, and you want to buy this baseball, and it turns out this $4.99 baseball you actually can't afford because there's 5% sales tax, right? That's not exactly a per unit tax, but it captures the idea, which is like the amount that comes out of your wallet has to pay for both the goods as well as for the tax. So the idea is whatever quantity the consumer is able to buy, they're going to pay for this amount of goods, but then they also have to pay for the tax on top of it. So that's why we model the demand curve inclusive of the tax as like a leftward shift by like everywhere lower by an amount equal to the tax. If we go all the way up to the vertical intercept, right here would be the amount of money, the most money that can come out of the willingness to pay, the most money that come out of the buyer's wallet, and then, well, that from whatever is that $5, you also have to deduct whatever is that tax. And that brings us down here to the amount of the cost of goods that consumers are able to afford. So that's like where we get this line right here from. Right? So either way, whether we're going to model this as a tax on buyers or a tax on sellers, right? The distance between the price buyers pay and price sellers receive, this vertical distance, is going to be the size of the tax, right? Whatever is the per unit tax, and then tax revenue is actually this rectangle right here, right? It's the size of the tax over the units sold. And in this triangle right here, this would be the deadweight loss generated by the tax. What's happened is at the higher price, there's going to be a smaller quantity. And these units right here between QT and Q star are no longer traded. They're no longer bought or sold. Why? Because when the tax is assessed, it kind of raises artificially the production costs above which consumers are willing to pay, or after paying for goods worth this amount, consumers don't have enough money left over to pay for the tax. So kind of two interpretations according to whether we're thinking of this as a tax on buyers or tax on sellers. And then the last thing that I should mention is relative to like assessing tax incidence. We could compare the equilibrium price to the price buyers pay and price sellers receive. And if the price buyers pay is higher than the equilibrium price is higher by an amount greater than the amount price sellers receive is lower, then we say the tax incidence falls on buyers. All right, so or the greater proportion of the tax is borne by buyers. All right, but getting back to my original question, per unit tax does not generally raise the equilibrium price by an amount equal to the tax. So the confusion is, you might say, oh, well, we could just like take the equilibrium price, add the tax to it, and then this would be the price buyers pay. No, and you can see why that doesn't happen as you kind of look at what's happened relative to this graph. Is if this was the price, right? If this was the price, we'd have to walk way back here, and no longer is that the quantity, right? And so what ends up happening is because of the fact that the demand curve is like way back here, if we took this quantity and added the taxable amount to it, right? So if this was the quantity and this was the equilibrium price, and now added the per unit tax for however many units this was, that's clearly above the willingness to pay a consumer's got, right? Because for this amount of goods, they're willing to pay this amount, right? And we have to walk back up the demand curve to get to that same height. And if we did that, there's no longer any room for the tax, right? So what ends up happening? How do we assess the per unit tax? Well, what ends up happening is we keep in mind the principle that at the equilibrium or at the quantity that results when the tax is assessed, The demand curve and supply curve must be apart by the same vertical distance. This vertical distance has to be apart by the same size of the per unit tax, right? Because the price buyers pay, the amount coming out of the buyer's wallet, we need to be able to deduct tax from that and then have sellers have enough left over to be able to pay for the goods, the cost of the goods they're producing. All right, so with price controls, price floors, so price controls, price floors, and price ceilings don't set the price, they only constrain it. So if we're thinking of a price floor, it's a legal minimum. Price ceiling is a legal maximum. When a price control is imposed on the market, you might think the government has set the price. It's only true actually if the price control is binding, right? So binding price control is one that prevents the price from reaching the equilibrium. It stops at wherever would be the floor, or whatever would be the price control in the case of if it's binding. So for instance, for a price floor, it's the government sets a legal minimum above the true price, right? Then the price ultimately is prevented from going lower. For a price ceiling, the government sets a legal maximum that's below the true price, and then the price is prevented from going higher. So what I've drawn right here, right? Firstly, let's just consider whatever is this price. Anytime we consider a price, we always want to find what's the quantity supplied at that price, what's the quantity demanded at that price, right? We also have to give an interpretation. Is this a price floor or a price ceiling? Well, if this is a price floor, it's non-binding, because a price floor would say, if P hat is a price floor, it'd say, oh, well, price cannot go any lower than P hat. And everyone in the market would say, fine, we don't care, because we want the price to be here anyway. There's no downward pressure to try to lower the price any further below this amount, or below the equilibrium, right? Now, if we had a massive rightward shift to supply, or if we had a massive leftward shift to demand, that could change the equilibrium price and push it below this line. But for the time being, with this present equilibrium, this would be a non-binding price floor. However, if this is a price ceiling, telling us that the price can go no higher, now we've got a problem, because the equilibrium is way up here, and if P hat is a price ceiling, it's telling us, well, even though you want the price to adjust upward, it can go no higher than here. So if P hat is a price floor, what's going to be the prevailing price in this market? Oh, just the equilibrium price right here. But what if P hat is a price ceiling? Now the price in the market will be P hat. And the quantity supplied at P hat is right here. The quantity demanded at P hat is right here. Because quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied, as is the case for all below equilibrium prices, we'd have a shortage, right? Okay, so externalities. Externalities are not just about unintended consequences. Externalities are bystander effects, right? They're external benefits, external harms that the original decision makers are ignoring when setting their optimal level of the activity that's generating them, right? The key is they're external to the decision maker. So for instance, in the case of smoking, if smoking is the primary activity, right, secondhand smoke imposes an external cost. If there's bystanders nearby, now we've got an externality, right? Remember, with externalities, it's sort of like if a tree falls in the forest and there's no one there to hear it, does it make a sound? Well, with externalities, if there's this additional effect, if there's no bystanders, there's no externality, right? So if you just have like a smoker by themselves in the middle of like open area and the smoke kind of dissipates before it reaches anyone else, there's actually no secondhand smoke and there's no bystander, right? So then there's no externality. But if there's others nearby that are then affected, now we've got bystanders, now we've got an externality. What about lung cancer or other health effects? Well, though that's probably an unintended consequence for the decision maker, right, it's not an externality. And the reason why is because it's occurring to the smoker themselves, right? So lung cancer for the smoker themselves is a private cost. Now, sure, if the bystander gets lung cancer, now all of a sudden we've got a situation where that's a negative externality, right? Something that has affected a bystander. But the negative health effects to the smoker themselves, not an externality, simply an unintended consequence or like just a private cost. All right, tariffs. So a tariff means everyone in the market buying that good is going to pay the tariff price. However, not everyone pays the tariff, right? Because tariffs are specifically taxes on imports. What the tariff is going to do is raise the price at which the foreign goods are allowed to compete with the domestic producers. So the tariff increases the price of the good in the economy. However, if you buy from a domestic producer, you just pay whatever is that price, and and all the proceeds go to that domestic producer. However, if you buy an import, now you're going to pay the tax to the government. You're going to pay the tariff on the import, and then the remainder goes to the foreign producer. Right? So if you buy from a domestic producer, you're not going to pay the tariff because tariffs are taxes on imports. You pay the tariff if you buy an imported good. So here's that picture. So here's my domestic demand, here's my domestic supply, here's my world price, and here's my world price plus the tariff. One of the most common mistakes, like drawing this graph, would be accidentally trying to draw the tax picture from before, right? Trying to add the tariff onto the domestic supply. That doesn't make any sense because the tariff is a tax on imports, right? So we want to draw in the world price, right? And we're assuming that the world is going to be able to supply whatever is in this market, and so we'll draw essentially the world supply curve as horizontal at the world price. So meaning that at this price, we're going to be able to, we'll be able to obtain an amount equal to the quantity demanded at that world price without also changing the world price. Anyway, so here's the world price. Here's the world price plus the tariff. Now, if there's no free trade, the equilibrium price is what will prevail in this economy, right, in this market. Now, if we open our doors to free trade, all of a sudden, what becomes the price? The world price. And the reason why is because buyers are going to say, why would we pay this price when there's foreign producers standing by willing to sell it to us at PW, which is much lower? So the domestic producers don't like that very much. They lobby the government. Government says, okay, we'll have a tariff. So that raises the price in this economy. What that does is in this market, what that does is it allows more domestic producers back in the market. In particular, at the domestic equilibrium price, the quantity supplied domestically is all the way over here. But as we go to the world price, all the sellers lower out to right here, the sellers along this line. Remember, the theory of demand is the theory of marginal benefit. The theory of supply is the theory of marginal cost. So the vertical height of the supply curve is the cost to sellers. These sellers right here, they're undercut by foreign producers at the world price. So they leave the market. And they're the ones, factories shutting down, who are going to be arguing to the government, oh, we should have a tariff. So what happens is with the tariff inclusive world price, now these sellers are back in the market, right? So these sellers with higher costs than the world price are able to re-enter the market because they don't have to compete at the world price. They're going to compete at the world price plus the tariff, which allows them back in. These sellers right here, they're still undercut even with the tariff, unless we set the tariff high enough to be able to bring the world price plus the tariff equal to the domestic price, in which case there wouldn't be any imports. Now, what's happened as a result? Well, at the world price, at the original world price, the quantity supplied domestically is right here. Quantity demanded domestically is right here. So this distance, this big distance between QS at PW and QD at PW is all the imports. Then what's happened at the higher, once the world price, once the tariff is attached to the world price, is the amount of imports shrinks to this amount right here. Because here's the quantity supplied at the tariff inclusive world price, and here's the quantity demanded at the tariff inclusive world price. So now imports is smaller. Tariff revenue is this area right here. This triangle right here is deadweight loss, right? Because at the tariff inclusive world price, these units are no longer demanded, right? Higher price, lower quantity demanded. This area right here, well, that's not deadweight loss. It's actually still inefficiency. It's capturing the fact that these domestic sellers are now producing these quantities, but they're not the most efficient producers. Actually, they have higher costs, so we've lost some efficiency because we have more efficient foreign producers who actually should be producing those units from the standpoint of efficiency. All right, number 9, shutdown rule. So a competitive firm is going to shut down when the price is lower than average variable cost. So P is less than AVC, not just when price is less than average total cost. So what's happening if price is below average variable cost is the firm's taking inputs, transforming them into something that's worth less, and therefore they should quit it. So that's like if I have my cookie factory, I'm taking my ingredients, I'm paying for sugar, flour, eggs, whatever, bringing them together, making cookies, and people are paying less for them than it cost me to make them, right? In terms of like all the ingredients. So then I should shut down. Like my cookie factory is actually terrible, so I don't want to be in that market, right? So if the price is below average variable cost, then if the price is below average variable cost, then we should quit because we're actually we're destroying value by producing whatever is this output using those inputs. On the other hand, if the price is above average variable cost, we know at least we're transforming the inputs into something worth more than when we started, right? Even if the factory that we're producing the cookies in is too expensive for us, we know at least all the ingredients we're transforming into cookies, we're actually creating value, right? So that's my comment here. Just because you're able to sell the cookies for more than what you paid for its ingredients doesn't mean you're going to be overall profitable, right? Could have really high fixed cost, you're unable to recoup. So in that case, if the price is less than average total cost, the firm will produce in the short run, but it's got to exit in the long run, right? Shutdown is a short run concept. Price is less than average variable cost. Exit is the long run concept. If price is less than average total cost, then you exit in the long run. Last thing, Nash Equilibrium. So a Nash Equilibrium is not about maximizing profit. It's not about winning, even though we call it game theory, right? Or anything like that. The Nash Equilibrium is just defined as the outcome, or as an outcome where all players are currently best responding. So an outcome is a Nash Equilibrium if no one has a profitable unilateral deviation, meaning nobody is able to improve their payoffs when they're the only one to switch their strategy, right? And the way that we find Nash equilibria is by seeking out best responses, and therefore we've identified a mutual best response. We've got a Nash equilibrium, and we've got a situation where nobody's going to have a profitable unilateral deviation. Relatedly, a dominant strategy dominates a player's own other options, not their rival. Right, so dominant strategy sounds like this is how you're going to win the game or something, which also has no interpretation. Dominant strategy doesn't dominate your rival. You might think it does, but it doesn't. What the dominant strategy does is it dominates your other options, right? So a strategy that's always a best response is going to be a dominant strategy. Now, relative to like the game theory, that's a super imprecise statement to what I just said, but at the principles level, it's sufficient to keep us moving in the right direction. All right, so here's a game I want to consider. We have two players, right? So to be able to model something as a game, we've got to have players, strategies, and payoffs. So we have row player who can select the top row or the bottom row. We have column player who can select the left column or the right column. When row player selects the top column, or when row player selects the top row and column player selects the left column, row player gets 3, column player gets 4. If row player selects the bottom row and column player selects the right column, row gets 1, column gets 6, right? The first number goes to row player, the second number goes to column player. They're choosing their strategies simultaneously without observing the rival, and then whichever ordered pair we pick out, think about like there's the old game Battleship, you kind of call it coordinates. That's essentially what we're doing here. All right, so let's look for best responses. Row's best response to column's choice of left, right? If column selects left, what's row's best response? Well, top yields 3, bottom yields 0, so it's top. What's row's best response to column's choice of right? Well, top yields 1, top yields 7, bottom yields 1, so the best response to column's choice of right is top, right? And notice in finding best responses, what do? We considered row's choices against row's payoff for one of its choices to row's payoff for its other choice. We didn't say anything about the other player's payoffs, right? So when deciding that top is a best response to left, I compared 3 to 0, and that was enough, right? To find out that top is a best response to right, I compared 7 to 1. I didn't say anything about 4 or 0 or 3 or 6, right? You only pay attention to the player's payoffs that are corresponding to whoever's choosing. All right, now column's best response to row's choice of top. Row selects top, column can control whether column's got a 4 or a 3. 4 is bigger than 3, so column's best response to row's choice of top is left. What about column's best response to row's choice of bottom? Row selects bottom, column can get 0 for choosing left or 6 for choosing right. We're going to choose right. So here we've identified all the best responses. We could actually put check marks or underlines or whatever corresponding to this, but if you're kind of tracking where we're identifying best responses, it turns out like our pair is left top, right? And then that's these payoffs here. So there's one Nash equilibrium, right? Top left. And we have a dominant strategy for row. It's top, right? Row's best response to column's choice of left and right is top. So top is a dominant strategy. What does top dominate? Bottom, right? So top is better than bottom here, right? So we have a dominant strategy, and therefore we know that's actually part of any Nash equilibrium. So that's an important result is if a player has a dominant strategy, in this case top, right? It's got to be part of any Nash equilibrium. Sure enough, it is, because the equilibrium is top left. All right, so what about for column? Does column have a dominant strategy? No, because left is a best response to top, but right is best response to bottom, right? So even though column always has a best response, column does not have a dominant strategy. Column lacks a dominant strategy, right? So we do have a unique Nash equilibrium. Is this a prisoner's dilemma? No. For a game to be a prisoner's dilemma, both players have to have a dominant strategy, and joint payoffs have to be higher when they both play their non-dominant strategy. That didn't happen here. We know immediately this is not a prisoner's dilemma because column does not have a dominant strategy. Is this a coordination game, or is it an anti-coordination game? Neither. It's not either a coordination game nor an anti-coordination game, and the reason why is because row has a dominant strategy of top, right? If one of the players has a dominant strategy in a 2x2 matrix, you don't have a coordination game, right? Because in the coordination game or an anti-coordination game, we'd have to have multiple equilibria here, and so the only way that this would work is if we had complementary best responses, right? So like, so if we change the payoffs so that row player wanted to select bottom exactly when column player selected right, for instance. Though that's not what happened here. Okay, very good. So I hope you enjoyed the video. And then go ahead, leave a like, a comment, or question, and I can kind of follow up with greater clarifications. This is a draft of another project that I've got going on. But anyhow, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time.